Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for being here today also. We are going to listen to Professor Sadusky's second lectures on populism against democracy. As he anticipated yesterday, today we'll delve into more constitutional elements of this topic. For those of you who weren't here yesterday, Professor Sadusky will wrap up some of the introductory explanations that he gave yesterday, just to build a framework, a backdrop against which to elaborate what he's going to deal with today and tomorrow. So now I'm not taking any more of our time, and I'll give you the floor to Professor Sadusky. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Barbizon, and it's a great pleasure to be here for the second day, and I hope that I'll be seeing you tomorrow again for the third day. But for the time being, let me just make two very short preliminary comments before I go to the resume of yesterday. So one is pleasant, one is unpleasant. The pleasant point I would like to make before the lecture is to acknowledge and welcome and celebrate the presence of a very, very great man, great legal scholar of Italy, and a great father at certain point of this university, Professor Alberto Febbraio, who is here, and thank you so much. He's also my great friend, so I'm at many levels extremely happy to welcome Professor Febraio here. That's a pleasant part of my intro. And unpleasant is that, you know, coming from Poland, I have realized, like probably most of you, having had a look at today's online news or newspapers, that what was initially thought two Russian missiles landed in Polish territory. And of course, that would mean an extremely sharp toughening of the conflict, which I don't call conflict, invasion, unilateral invasion of Putin against Ukraine, because it would mean basically attack upon a NATO member state. And you know what happens under NATO agreement, under Article 5, what are the responsibility of all other member states of NATO. So it seems from the very last minute information, which I checked in the internet just before coming here, is that while, you know, not all information is certain, according to the US intelligence, which must be reasonably good, there was one missile which was in fact probably Ukrainian missile, which is anti-air missile, which was meant to annihilate a Russian missile, but it was probably either badly programmed or there was human error. But whatever it was, it just shows something I mentioned yesterday at the beginning, and that is that the invasion against Ukraine adds extra topicality to our discussions here. Because one thing is certain: authoritarian, autocratic, despotic states are dangerous. They are not only dangerous for their own population, whom they terrorize, they are also inherently dangerous to the outside world, because regimes such as Putin's regime simply cannot tolerate the fact that a nation next to its territory, which in many respects is similar to Russian nation in terms of the dominant religion, language, etc., has decided to go along the democratic path. It is this intolerance for democracy, which by Putin and his acolytes is seen as a threat to their own regime, which is a real source of this horrible war. And we are being reminded every day about its horrors. Now, to those of you who haven't been yesterday, let me just make a very brief summary. I suggest that there are basically three main takeaways which one should retain from yesterday's lecture. The first one is that populism, the way I understand it, is an institutional phenomenon rather than a phenomenon of a discourse. This is a big division in contemporary scholarship. At certain point, a synthesis probably of both approaches would be desired, but as a lawyer, as a constitutional scholar, as someone who does not apologize for that specialty, my main focus is on what populists do to institutions, to democratic institutions, rather than what sort of discourse, what sort of narrative they develop, even though tomorrow morning I will begin, because it would be incomplete if I didn't, by talking a little bit about the dominant populist narrative, in particular about conspiracy theories. So that's the first point, populism as an institutional phenomenon. The second point is that populism, the way I understand it, and of course one may, any definition of populism is stipulative rather than descriptive, you know, and all that matters is that this is a definition which captures something important, and there's no point discussing forever what is a real populism. So my understanding of populism is that it is inherently non-democratic. And it is non-democratic because it's some sort of, as some people call it, hybrid regime, a mixed regime, in which there are some elements of democracy, especially the fact that the government emerges from free and, by and large, fair elections. So the government has a strong electoral legitimacy. If it doesn't, I don't count it populist. I consider it to be simply authoritarian or autocratic, whatever names you give to it. So we are dealing with a system in which the government is created, is generated through free and fair elections. However, there are at least two, and secondly, on the sort of positive side, populist governments, by and large, respect civil and political rights of citizens. Populist states are not states in which prisons are full of political opponents of the regime. They have different ways of manipulating the law against its critics. On the negative side, populist regimes offend against two fundamental principles of democracy. First, dispersion of power. Second, the rule of law. And in that sense, populism, the way I understand and discuss it, is non-democratic. So you may say it's somewhere halfway between good consolidated democracy with good accountability of the government, with democratic control also between the elections. So, and on the other hand, an openly non-democratic government which even do not pretend, and if they pretend, it's just sham, that they have electoral legitimacy. And the last, so this is the second takeaway of yesterday. And the third takeaway would be that there is not a single populism, there is a certain thoughtless simplicity in talking about populism and a phenomenon of populism, the wave of populism. There are populisms with an S at the end in plural. Because, and that's the main point I tried to make, populism is a wrong answer to good questions. The questions are good, the questions are real. There are a set of various concerns that citizens have. And populists win citizens' support by giving bad answers, simplistic answers, and often very dangerous answers, but at least they resonate with some important concerns. But these concerns are different in different countries. So I tried to produce a list of 5 main types of concerns which normally generate populist support. They are issues such as status anxiety, about relative decline of one's group's status. There is xenophobia, hatred of the others. There is anti-elite or anti-establishment animus. There is anti-globalism and sort of return of nationalism, economic but also cultural. And finally, anti-modernism, which may mean anti-secularism, anti-enlightenment, anti-equality, anti-environmental concerns, etc. And these 5 types of, and of course there may be more, I don't have any pretense for comprehensiveness. These 5 concerns occur in different countries, in different configurations, and in different intensities. And there are some countries which we now call populist, in which some of these concerns simply are non-existent and others are existent to a much higher degree. And that is why at the end of the day, when we start looking at particular examples of populism, we have to be sensitive to those differences. Okay, so much for yesterday. Now today I would like, in our today's lecture, to focus on something that is close to my heart, at least in professional and academic sense, and that is to 2 aspects interrelated. First, I'll be talking about populist constitutionalism. What are populist constitutions, why they are there, and what generally populist leaders do to constitutions, because they do some pretty damaging things to constitutions. And the second part, larger part, will be on institutions, that is institutional conduct of populists, of populist leaders, populist politicians, and in particular about courts. Because, you know, we are lawyers, I mean, many of us are lawyers, we are particularly concerned about courts, but so I will focus mainly on courts, but also at some other institutions which are considered to be important to democracy. In particular, I'll be looking at institutions dealing with elections, electoral commissions, and also institutions which control or regulate media. I think that's the menu. That's the menu for today. Okay, and just to foreshadow, tomorrow I'll be talking about three main issues: about populist narratives, about populists dealing with the COVID, and the wrap up or the conclusions about the ways out. If populism is a disease, do we have a medication for it? Do we have a medicine for it? All right. Let me start with populist constitutions. So if, as I said, it is true that populists do not respect the principles of separation of powers, dispersion of power, and further, if they don't respect the principle of the rule of law, which basically means law should control politics rather than vice versa, why would populists care about constitutions? In other words, why would they like, if they only can, to introduce their new constitution rather than simply abandon the old one and rule by decree or by ad hoc decisions? And yet, for authoritarians, not just for populists, constitutions are useful. And they are useful not in a way in which, democratically speaking, constitutions are important in the sense that they establish and protect separation of powers and individual rights and the rule of law, that is, they entrench certain rules of the game in a way that you cannot change them as you play that game. No, they need it for something else. And let me begin, therefore, with a short taxonomy of functions of constitution in authoritarian states. That is, states which disrespect at least these two main principles, dispersion of powers and the rule of law. Because they have some functions. And we know that whenever populists come to power, they want to replace the old constitution. Sometimes they manage to, like in Hungary in 2011, or in Venezuela in 1999. Sometimes they try, but simply do not succeed, like in Poland or in the Philippines. And sometimes they don't even try, like in India. But usually, the usual aspiration of populists who have just come to power with the electoral legitimacy supporting them, their big aspiration, their big prize is to replace the old constitution. Why? Let me here use a taxonomy used by or proposed by a colleague of mine, Professor Günther Frankenberg of Frankfurt University, because there's no point in sort of inventing the wheel if someone else has already done it better than I could do. And here is, I always press the wrong one. Okay, so here is my rendition, my interpretation of a rather complex taxonomy of functions of authoritarian constitutions. And I think that Professor Frankenberg, in his reasonably recent book, published by Edward Elgar in around 2019, I think, called simply Authoritarianism. So the book is not about populism only, but I'm using his conceptual architecture, so to speak, for my purposes. I think he's done a very good job. So as you can see, this is a rather complex outline in which he says, well, authoritarians need constitution. They can make good use for their own purposes. And those functions are, you cross two taxonomies, a taxonomy related to the audience, whether the intended audience of your new constitution is internal, your own population, or external, the outside world. For example, European Union. And the other division is between purposes which are instrumental, like being means to an end, and purposes which are symbolic, to send a certain symbolic message. And now if you cross these two divisions, these two taxonomies, that is internal versus external, and instrumental versus symbolic, you get four main functions of authoritarian constitutions. So first he says, let's look at the instrumental purposes. From the point of view of the internal audience, constitution may serve as what Frankenberg calls a governance manual. Okay, you are a leader, right? You are a president or prime minister in a parliamentary system. You are a Viktor Orban, okay? Or you are Chavez, President Chavez. You know that your will is the ultimate source of any political decisions. But you must rely on a large structure of your subordinates, ministers, governors, presidents of various committees and commissions, etc. There is, the governing a modern state is a complex enterprise. So just like you need a manual for a complex, I don't know, washing machine or dishwasher or whatever, you also need a manual for the state and for the governance. So this is the function. It's basically like telling the administrators, what are their functions? What does leader expect of them? Now, instrumental purposes for the external audience is here this number 2 cell, in which Frankenberg calls constitution as identity card. It's like an ID, okay? It is, you show to the international community, to the world public opinion, or to international organizations such as the United Nations, or if you are a member state of the EU, in the EU, look, here we are a card-carrying member of that particular community. You have to recognize us as such. You have to deal with us, and you have to respect us, okay? And then we move to symbolic purposes, and for the internal audience, the symbols that the new constitution sends is an important mobilizing document. It mobilizes people. It gives them some sources of support, respect for the authorities, compliance, etc. For example, by sending a message, as the new Hungarian constitution did, that this is no longer some sort of post-communist state. We are a big Christian nation, and we are proud of it. And that type of message, which connects you to the real or imagined tradition, is an important source of building loyalty among the citizens. Or if you are like Hugo Chavez, you make different symbolic statements. We are part of the great Bolivarian tradition of Latin America, which is, in contrast to the right-wing phraseology of Orban, is a very much left-wing phraseology of Latin American traditions for fight of independence. But you somehow connect yourself with something that you see as being very important. And of course, there is also the symbolic message to be sent to the outside world. And this is what Frankenberg calls constitution as a showcase. That is, we try to impress the outside world about, we are perhaps better than many of your member states are now. I mean, that is what current leaders, current government in Poland keeps telling the European Union. We are the real Europeans because we are Christians and you are not. You are some sort of wishy-washy secular mix, but we are true Europe, the heart of Europe. Unfortunately for them, they couldn't say it in their constitution, so they say it through their speeches, etc. But if only they could have a constitution with some sort of invocation of God at the beginning, and with emphasis on the religion in its preamble, etc., they could showcase their country and use it as some sort of asset in international recognition. Okay, so this is a list of functions of constitution for authoritarians, which, as you see, are quite different from the typical function of democratic constitution, which we normally consider to be entrenchment of the general rules of the game, which actors cannot change in an ad hoc manner, B, separation of powers and making sure that the powers do not intrude on each other, and C, strong enactment of individual rights. These would be the typical functions of a democratic constitution. The functions of authoritarian constitutions are completely different, but they are, again, important for authoritarians, and that is why authoritarians care and want to have a new constitution. But as I had already mentioned, it doesn't happen all that often, and this is my menu for my talk about populist constitutions. So let me start with with those cases which may be called constitutional replacements. By the way, this photo shows a woman at a demonstration in Poland, and it has this very nice graphic of the Polish spelling of the word constitution. And it became very famous because the way colors are designed here, it is at the same time the word constitution, but also it sort of emphasizes in white letters T-Y, which means you, and the last two letters J-A, ja, meaning me. So it's some sort of a symbolic message. Constitution is not something that is part of the officialdom. It's something about you and me. It's about us. It's about real people. And this symbol on various posters, but also badges, etc., became extremely popular in Poland. So I think it nicely illustrates the issues of constitution in populist states and also in the resistance against populism. Okay, let me just say a few words about the two examples of constitutional replacement. That is, two cases in which ruling populists managed to bring about a completely new constitution, not just to amend the pre-existing constitution, but completely replace it. And there are two examples which I'm using here. That is Venezuela of 1999, when Hugo Chavez came to power, and Hungary in 2011, when Viktor Orban for the second time came to power in 2010. And the constitution entered into force 1st January 2012. There were some others. There were at least 2 or 3 other populist new constitutions in Latin America, in Ecuador, for example. But these two nicely illustrate certain commonalities, but also differences among brand new constitutions of populists. So first, there are certain commonalities regarding the process of constitution making, as opposed to the outcome, to the actual substance of the constitution. So let me just make a few points about the process, constitution making process. And as many constitutional lawyers and scholars know, process is often as important as the outcome, and sometimes even more important, because normally constitution making process serves various, as we call, content independent purposes. Certain degree of mobilization and deliberation and building community again around so-called constitutional patriotism, etc., etc. Now, there are some commonalities between constitution making process in these two countries which I use as examples. One is frantic pace of constitution making. When you normally think about constitution making, you think about something that should be to some extent drawn out, that should have certain temporal dimension. It cannot happen overnight. Think about great contemporary or recent cases of constitution making in post-totalitarian or post-authoritarian countries. In Poland, it took basically between 1989 and 2007, a long time to get to a brand new full constitution. In South Africa, it took, I think, 5 or 6 years with several steps with constitution making in 2 stages. First, some sort of draft of the constitution, then it would be verified by a new constitutional court, which would sort of certify it as consistent with the compromise achieved between white minority and the ANC. In other words, constitution requires certain breath, okay, certain breathing space, certain time. And yet these populist new constitutions had been brought about extremely, extremely quickly. In Venezuela, it took just a few months, 6 or 7 months. In Hungary, it took not much longer. Orban won in April 2010, and by March 2011, the new constitution was already adopted. It entered into force on the 1st of January next year. So still, by constitutional standards, it was very, very fast. And of course, the speed meant that there was very little room for any genuine consultation and deliberation. It was basically fast-tracked enterprise event. Secondly, it was in both cases completely unilateral, in the sense that the winning party, in the presidential system of Venezuela, of Chavez and his group of collaborators and supporters, in the case of Hungary, of Fidesz party with Orban, they avoided any inclusion of the opposition into the constitution making process. In Hungary, it was just ostentatious. The small constitution drafting committee was composed only of Fidesz people, of the ruling party. And the same was the case in Venezuela. So unilateral, one-sided, you may call imposition of a constitution upon the opposition, which was completely sidelined from that process. And finally, in neither of these cases, the rules of constitutional change, which were provided for by the previous constitution, were fully observed. In other words, these were not constitutions brought about fully consistently with the rules of constitutional change provided by the previous constitution. So you didn't have continuity in this sort of sense of constitutional continuity, you have a radical change. This change was much more radical in Venezuela than in Hungary, because in Venezuela, basically, the old constitution of 1961, actually one of very few constitutions of Latin America which was genuinely liberal democratic. Which doesn't mean to say that Venezuela before Chavez was a stellar example of democracy. It was basically oligarchy. But at the political level, the system of liberal democratic principles enacted in 1961 constitution were pretty good. But what Chavez did was basically to completely renounce the old constitution and set up a constituent assembly, thus erasing the existing institutions, in particular the parliament and the old Supreme Court. So constituent assembly was visualized as being what is called in constitutional theory after the French name pouvoir constituant, or potere costituente, potere costituente. That is, it's almost like, imagine that you can have two levels. You can have a dualism of potere costituente, the power which establishes other powers, and pouvoir constituer, potere costituito. So that what Chavez did was to set up completely new potere costituente. And by the way, this example was followed by quite a number of other neighbor states in Latin America, including in Ecuador, it declared itself as almost starting the system from the scratch, not being bound by whatever rules of constitutional amendment and constitutional change were provided before. In Hungary, it was somewhat less radical, and it was less radical because there wasn't really a coherent, consistent previous constitution in Hungary after the fall of communism in 1989. In fact, it was still the old communist constitution, but very, very heavily amended. So it was basically like a patchwork type of constitution. The most, if you wanted to read what is the actual constitution of Hungary prior to that time, prior to 2010, you had to look at different, if you like, at the core of the old constitution plus all the amendments which completely changed it. It was a mess. But within this mess, one thing was sure: in order to change the constitution, therefore also to bring about new constitution, you need 2/3 majority, which Orban had. So he managed to enact a new constitution in accordance with the constitutional majority. But soon after the fall of communism, an amendment was adopted that in order to prepare a draft of the constitution, not a new constitution, but a draft of the constitution, you need 4/5 majority. So it very greatly elevated the threshold for draft of the constitution. And the idea behind it in the early 2000s was that because the parliament and Hungarian politics was so fragmented and polarized, you really need a degree of consensus for drafting of the constitution. And of course, Orban didn't have this 4/5 majority required for a draft. So what did he do? Of course, he abolished this requirement with a parliamentary resolution. Parliamentary resolution adopted with 2/3, which Orban had. By the way, he had this 2/3 majority in the parliament, even though he won barely over 50% of votes in the elections. But that's just a matter of converting raw vote of voters into a number of seats in the parliament. That's the case all over the world, but this is just digression. So in a sense, by violating this rule of 4/5 for drafting of the constitution, as opposed to enacting of the new constitution, enacting of that draft, Orban also breached constitutional continuity because in a very important way, he disregarded the rules for constitutional change. So, first aspect of constitutional making was frantic pace. Second was that it was unilateral, no attempt at consensus. Third, that there was a breach of prior rules for constitutional change. So much for constitutional making process. Now, when it comes to constitutional substance, I mean, these are two very different constitutions. Venezuelan constitution is what you may call very left-wing constitution, progressive, in accordance with Chavez ideology. Orban's constitution is very conservative, right-wing constitutionalist. But there are certain common features. One is that in both cases, there has been a huge centralization of power. What is sometimes called executive aggrandizement. That is that the executive acquired huge, yes? Can I explain something? Because if there is something I'm saying which is ununderstandable or anyone would like a clarification, please do not hesitate and let me know, and I'll be very happy to explain. So the great centralization of power, great strengthening of the executive, in the case of Hungary, of prime minister, but also of president. So far, president in Hungary had been completely symbolic, much more symbolic figure even than in Italy, where president doesn't have such a huge power, okay, lacking independent electoral legitimacy. But in Hungary, traditionally, president was really purely, a person who would open new schools and things like that, And yet, this constitution gave president extra power, knowing full well that the president would come from the same party as the prime minister, because it's the parliament which elects president in Hungary. It has reduced the powers of the parliament, for example, the budgetary powers, by, for instance, creating an extra parliamentary 5-person body. So it's a very, very tiny body, which de facto obtained a power of veto over budget voted by the parliament. So the all-important functions of budget making were centralized in a very, very small executive institution. When it comes to the presidential system of Venezuela, what was done by the constitution was to greatly relax presidential term limits. Before, under the 1960s, which is a very sensitive issue in Latin America generally, okay? Are there any term limits or not for the president, for the chief executive? In Venezuela, under the old constitution, president could perform only one term of 4 years. In Venezuela, in the 1999 constitution of Chavez, it was converted or changed into 2 terms of 6 years each. So it already went from 4 to 12 years. And later, with a later constitutional amendment, even that was abandoned. So when it comes to the actual structure of powers, both constitutions converged. There was this common denominator, great centralization and aggrandizement of the executive. There were also interesting similarities and differences when it comes to purely symbolic matters. That is, both these constitutions are very heavy on strong symbolism, going up to the point in which Hungarian constitution changed the name of the state. Before, the official name of that country was Republic of Hungary. The constitution of Orban changed it into, yeah, you guessed it, simply Hungary. Why bother with the republic? It may give some sort of strange ideas to people with the Republican ideals and so on. The preamble was called National Avowal. We avow. It's almost like, the nation coming together and committing itself to certain matters. And the Constitution, if you read especially the preamble, but also Charter of Rights, is extremely, extremely heavy on this religious Christian symbolism, which is sort of strange considering that Hungary is not a terribly religious state. Okay? It's not like Poland or Ireland or Portugal or perhaps Italy, where still the religion has a strong impact on individual lives and which is largely shared. Hungary is a very secular state, a little bit like Czech Republic or Slovakia. And yet, Orban thought that somehow for socio-technical reasons, it is good to inject as much of open religious references throughout the constitution. And of course, certain matters very dear to conservatives were openly enacted, such as that marriage is a union of a man and a woman, thus constitutionally excluding possibilities of same-sex marriages, and matters like this. So much basically for constitution making and constitutional substance in populist new constitutions. However, as I had mentioned, more often than not, populists, when they come to power, they do not enjoy such a majority which will give them possibility of adopting a new constitution. Not that they don't try, but they usually don't manage. In the Philippines, Duterte came to power on a platform of what became known in the Philippines as Cha-Cha, charter change, charter being the constitution. And that included a number of things, including sort of abolition of the de facto autonomy of the southern island of Mindanao, which is largely Muslim, and so on. But he quickly abandoned these plans, seeing that he can't do it. Same in Poland. In Poland, the Law and Justice Party came officially, had in its electoral campaign platform of 2015, they had their own constitutional draft of 2010, but it still was maintained as their constitutional proposal. And from time to time, in various constitutional discussions, they would open the drawer and take this draft and say, what do you say that we don't have constitutional proposal? We have constitutional proposal. But then they almost forgot about it conveniently. President Duda from time to time would try to return to an idea of constitutional referendum. And I wrote a good deal about it because his proposal of constitutional changes were often so stupid that no first-year law student would take it seriously. But it was always a little bit half-hearted, knowing it won't happen anyway because we don't have constitutional majority. In India, President Modi didn't even try to change the constitution formally. So what did they do? Well, the populists in this populist state, such as Poland, the Philippines, India, Brazil until Bolsonaro, used three different strategies of dealing with constitutional change in the absence of a formal power of constitutional change. And they were A, changing the constitution by statutes, B, changing the constitution by judgments of constitutional courts or supreme courts, as is the case in Brazil or the Philippines, which were sort of like captured by the populists, and 3, open, shameless constitutional breaches, simply breaching the constitution and going on pretending that nothing has happened. These 3 strategies, all these 3 strategies have been used in Poland, which is a good, or I should say perhaps a bad, example of these types of unconstitutional behavior. So let me start with the changing the constitution by statute. I mean, it sounds like a contradiction in terms, right? Statutes should be changed in order to conform with the constitution rather than vice versa, you know. But populists don't engage in that type of subtlety, and they thought that as long as there isn't any effective and dynamic Corte Costituzionale which would tell them, no, you can't do it, it's invalid, they simply would bring about statutes which were openly inconsistent with the Constitution. One example of that, and I'll come back to that example later when we talk about courts, is about National Council of Judiciary in Poland. A very important body because it's a body which decides about all judicial appointments. Not just appointments, but also promotions and demotions from the judiciary. So until Law and Justice came to power, this National Council of Judiciary had a majority of its members composed of judges elected by other judges. Okay? And that's consistent with a standard norm in Europe. What is a body in Italy, which is like equivalent of the National Council of Judiciary? It's Judicatura? No. What's the... Oh, Magistratura. Yeah. Consiglio Superiore di Magistratura. So you have an idea, you know, it's a body which is up in a state, because not all states have that type of recruitment of judges. But in those states, especially in Europe, where judges are appointed with the advice or by such a magistratura, there's an absolutely central institution. It's like a heart of the organism, of the body of judicial system. And what the new government of Law and Justice did was basically to decide by statute that the judicial members of the council would be elected no longer by judges, but by the parliament. Very simple change. I mean, parliament is more democratic. Yeah? Why would judges, I mean, that was the rhetoric. Why would judges co-opt other judges? Isn't it some sort of nepotistic, corrupt way of recruiting new judges? Let the parliament decide it. But parliament means the parliamentary majority, and parliamentary majority means the ruling party, and the ruling party means the leader in a system such as in Poland and Hungary. So de facto, all decisions about judges were concentrated in one person, one man, and sort of his advisors. He doesn't know all the judges in Poland. There are 10,000 judges, you know, but, you know, he has advisors who tell him which judge is loyal to the ruling party and who is not. So this is just an example of changing the constitution by statutes. Modi in India change the constitution, or at least constitutional customs, by statutes. For example, renouncing the territorial autonomy of Kashmir. So there are statutes as an instrument of de facto changing the constitution is one manner in which populist in government proceeded. The second, I said, is using your friendly constitutional court or Supreme Court. President Duterte in the Philippines tried to get rid of the president of Supreme Court. I think Maria Serena, if I remember well her name, because she stood up to him, and she wouldn't comply with his demands. A normal way of doing it would be to run it through an impeachment process, but he didn't sufficient majority in the Congress of the Philippines. So he used Supreme Court by its majority to basically remove her from office. And in Poland, there have been many, many cases because they managed to, they being the Law and Justice government, they managed to fully control Constitutional Court in a rather lengthy process, which maybe if I have time, I'll describe to you later when we talk about courts. But the outcome was that the Constitutional Court would do whatever they want. So they used Constitutional Court to support and endorse various decisions which were clearly unconstitutional. Just to give you an example. So one of the constitutional functions of the president of Poland, like almost everywhere in the world, is a power of pardon or of mercy, right? Pardoning convicted criminals. Like Trump does, like, I don't know whether in Italy, president of the republic has the power of pardon. Yeah. So it's something typical. It's not only about the president, but it's about the president and the Ministry of Justice. Right. Okay. So there is nothing particularly unusual. But what was unusual was that at some point the president elected with the populist vote, Andrzej Duda, who is still president of Poland, decided to pardon two ministers, a minister and deputy minister of Interior, who were convicted of abuse of office by illegal bugging of various opposition politicians. So listening to their phone conversations without a proper permission by a judge, which would be a normal requirement. And these two people, especially minister, whose name is Kamiński, were pretty central to the government and to the leader, maybe because they knew so much. They in fact knew too much. And no one would touch them, because if you touch them, they would have papers against you about, how you misbehave in your office or in your business transactions or your bed. These sort of various sensitive types of information. So what happened is Duda decided to pardon them, but to pardon them before the judgment became final. Basically, which means to stop further proceedings of appeal. I mean, under any legal system, if you are not sentenced by a final judgment, you are not really a sentenced person. You are really not a criminal. You still have to be seen as innocent. Because a person must be considered innocent unless proven guilty, but proven guilty means proven guilty in a final court decision from which there is no further appeal. But they were so much in a hurry in Poland that he decided to pardon them, which was just, at least in Polish tradition, completely unconstitutional, because you cannot pardon someone who is innocent. This little bit like giving divorce to a couple which is not really married. Yeah, that makes as much sense. But they were in a hurry. And of course, the matter became, well, what about Constitutional Court? What will they say? And of course, they said, that's perfectly fine. There is no problem about it. No, they kept endorsing, rubber stamping anything that the government did, regardless of its constitutionality. So this is the second form of dealing with the constitutions where you cannot have a new constitution, and that is by using constitutional courts. And the third one is simply not even bothering about constitutional courts, but simply breaching the constitution. You know, not even asking the constitutional court, or simply disregarding constitutional actions. My friend and colleague, an important constitutional lawyer from India, Tarun Khaitan, describing the actions of President Narendra Modi, coined this nice concept of constitutional shamelessness. Modi is constitutionally shameless. He simply doesn't care about the constitution, and Tarun gave a number of examples in which actions of Modi were clearly unconstitutional. For example, about issuing the IDs, while the Supreme Court says you can't do it because it violates this particular pattern of national IDs, is contrary to the principle of privacy. He didn't care. He went ahead for a better population control, etc. So, and so in the end, if they don't have their friendly constitutional court, and he doesn't have, Modi, because Supreme Court, while relatively weak in India now, relatively, how should I say, compliant, nevertheless is not completely captured by the president. So it will not rubber stamp anything that the president does, so president doesn't even ask them. Okay, here you have a picture, a landscape of constitutional conduct or misconduct by populists in power. So when you elect a populist to the government, and even if populist may to you look at first blush as a very nice person, okay, and having some good ideas, I mean, you should have this red alert, you know, if they manage to consolidate their power, and especially if they get re-elected and therefore become somehow entrenched in the government, this is a likely playbook which they be using in their actions. Let me move before the break to the last point here. And it is something I call literal democracy. And I'm a little bit proud of this pun because it is sort of like meant to be a paraphrase of liberal democracy. Why do I call it literal democracy with T rather than B in the middle? Because constitutionally speaking, and now I'm talking really as a constitutional scholar and I'm not looking at other aspects of it. One striking thing about populist approach to constitution is that they behave as if all that matter is the text. They try to stick very, very firmly to the text of the Constitution. But we all know, anyone who has touched any constitutional scholarship, we all know that constitutions everywhere, whether there are written constitutions, as in Italy, France, United States, or elsewhere, or unwritten constitutions, as in the UK, or Israel, or New Zealand, that constitutions are composed both of the text and of the unwritten norms. A constitution existing in the text only is absurd. You can't have it because constitution makers cannot foresee everything that may happen in future. So every constitution, especially after some time, acquires a certain body of unwritten norms, which may be called constitutional traditions, or constitutional customs, or constitutional conventions. And while, of course, at certain point there may be a disagreement precisely because they are unwritten. Of course, someone may write them down, but it's not like writing down a text on the Constitution. Constitutional scholars will try to write down their textbooks in which they will try to summarize constitutional traditions and constitutional conventions. But you cannot have a constitution without a certain degree of norms which are unwritten. Now, not every constitution has such a huge dimension of unwritten aspects as, for example, Australian constitution. When I teach my Australian students about written versus unwritten constitution, I tell them, look, imagine that you have a so-called Mars test. You have a Martian test. A man from, or a woman, or whatever their gender is, from Mars arrives and wants to find out something about the actual constitutional life in your country. What would he imagine Australia is? Well, first of all, he would imagine that the most important person of Australia is someone, until recently a woman, now a man, who lives thousands of kilometers away from Australia, is called the king, right? And there is no such thing as the government, there is executive council. The most important persons on the land of Australia are representatives of that king, who are called governor general and governors in particular states, etc., etc., etc. And you develop a certain story which has nothing to do with the reality. But it's not the case that day-to-day life in Australia is constant violation of constitution. No, it only means that constitution also has a great number of constitutional conventions, and most importantly, which are equally binding, equally valid as constitutional text. And now I'm not a specialist in Italian constitution, but I am sure that you can identify a number of unwritten meanings which are sort of attached to the constitution, even though they are not written down. One of the greatest constitutional law scholars in the United States, Ahil Amar Reed of Yale Law School, had a book, actually, a very thick book called Our Unwritten Constitution. And he uses a concept which I really like. He talks about reading a constitution between the lines. You don't only read the words, you also read what needs to be implied and assumed for these words to make sense. Okay, now to summarize, to close this long bracket, populists reject all that. They say, yeah, constitution, we are bound by the constitution. But if the constitution is silent about something, or seems to be saying something else, then it's basically the room for total discretion of the executive. So let me go back to the example of National Council of Judiciary in Poland. And again, it's not some sort of marginal issue. It is absolutely central issue to today's fight about the rule of law in Poland, but how judges are appointed and also how judges are fired from their position, discharged. This is the center of everything, of the whole judicial system. So the Constitution of 2007 says, okay, so there will be National Council of Judiciary composed of 25 members. 10 of these members are sort of ex officio. They are appointed by the president, by the Senate, by the parliament, etc. There is ex officio Chief Justice of the Supreme Court there, etc. But 15, so majority, are judges. And the Constitution doesn't precise how those judges are appointed. It's a clear omission in constitutional drafting. But from the very beginning, of the fall of communism of 1989, in the so-called round table discussions, it was immediately adopted that those judicial members of the National Council of Judiciary are elected by other judges. And it sort of makes sense. If there are judges, then it means that they are representatives of judges. If you are representative, you have to be elected by those whom you represent. And it became, since mid-1989, since June, it became an established practice that there was an increasingly complex pattern of elections in different levels of courts, and also different types of courts, administrative, criminal, etc., of electing judicial representatives to the council. It was maintained under the so-called small constitution, which led to the constitution of 2007. And so constitutional drafters didn't even care to put these extra words. Now we see it was a big mistake. But they didn't care because they took it for granted. And the problem with populists is that nothing can be taken for granted, because they will pick up and say, hey, wait a moment. They don't say who is appointing or electing those judicial members. And therefore, if it doesn't say that, it means that this is something that the legislator will decide. And yet it is simply equivalent to disregarding any constitutional meaning. And in one of my op-eds on this in Poland, I wrote, well, if you adopt, for the sake of argument, a position that if a constitution is silent on something, then it opens up infinite room for legislative discretion, that is, that you can decide in statutes anything. Well, what about if someone says that those judicial members of the National Council of Judiciary can be elected by the Catholic Episcopate of Poland, or by the Council of Football, or whatever? I mean, you know, the Constitution is silent. Absurd, of course absurd. But this absurdity just shows that even in the spaces which are left open by the text, there must be certain constitutional values and norms, and including norms of common sense, which control it and which don't open unlimited discretion to the legislators. And so this is one of the things to, in a sense, retain about constitutional conduct or misconduct of populists, that for them, the text is all that matters. When the text stops, the constitution stops, and they can do anything they want to. Okay, do you have any questions or observations before we take a pause? No? Okay, so, well, yes, please go ahead. Yes. Yes.
Thank you. I was thinking about all the examples of populist takeovers in Eastern Europe and considering which constitutional rule was the most efficient in preventing them. And I wanted to ask you if perhaps why judiciary in general proved quite weak, because lacking any popular support, perhaps a more effective tool for preventing all these executive aggrandizement were the local governments, because instead of trying to stop politics through law, they stop politics through politics. They have the same popular support as the national government.
Yes, absolutely. That is 100% correct. And when you look actually at some of the shocking populist governments, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, they are indeed facing the opposition from local governments, including local governments in the capital cities. That's the case in Hungary, where the mayor of Budapest, I think Karacsony is his name, something like that, is a big opponent of Fidesz and of Orban. In Poland, the president of Warsaw, and by the way, my ex-student, is Mr. Rafał Trzaskowski, who was recently an almost successful candidate for the presidency of Poland, and who is very anti-law and justice. When I think about all the major cities of Poland, they are all anti-ruling party, which sort of there is a certain regularity that big cities with highly educated population, population which is more cosmopolitan, people who travel more, people who earn more money. I don't want to sound arrogant in this sense, but this is statistically true, that big cities are usually more liberal than the national average. So when I think about all big cities in Poland, literally all, they have as their mayors people who are in the liberal democratic opposition to the government. There's the case of Krakow, very much of Gdańsk, of Poznań, of Wrocław, Białystok, and I could continue on and on. Perhaps even more interestingly, although this is no longer in my books a populist country, but much more oppressive, but at some point it was oppressive, Turkey. The mayor of Istanbul, not a capital city, but the largest and most important city in Turkey, is the opponent of President Erdogan. And Erdogan did all he could to make it impossible for that man, whose name I have just forgotten for a moment. What's his name? Imamodo, you know. Erdogan first tried to declare his election invalid, so there was a re-election and he was re-elected, and he is a real Democrat who stands up to the central powers. But there is, so yes, when you think about checking the central power, local governments are very important, but there is a catch in it, and everything depends on how strong are local powers in terms of their actual prerogatives, their competences, and their budgets. And of course, in the situation in which local government, at least in big cities, poses a threat or opposition to the central government will do their best to disempower those mayors, and often they become more of a symbolic. That is, they throw on them new duties. For example, you have to do more with less, more about education, about local transport, about plumbing and this and that. But you are being starved of money, and then you are being shown as being completely ineffective. You don't do things that the local powers are supposed to do, like build new roads or things like that. So yes, in principle, I agree, but we also should think of this reality of a steady erosion of the power of local government. And this erosion is not merely due to the fact that, politically speaking, local government is in the opposite party politics line. It's also because populists are, by their very nature, centralizers. They want to grab as much power in the central government. So to them, decentralization, not to mention federalism, is anathema. Talking about federalism. Federalism is like an F word in Poland. It is an ugly word. You mention federalism, you become immediately the enemy of the people. And I had this privilege of being declared the enemy of the people on the first page of a most popular Polish newspaper called Super Express, which is like a daily, you know, which is like, I don't know, in the UK, Daily Mirror. I don't know, because I think Italy doesn't have an equivalent of those, you know, sensationalist newspapers. Really very bad journalism, but would sell huge. I mean, you are lucky that more or less, whether you like a given newspaper or not, they are more or less in the tradition of serious journalism. But in many countries in Europe, you have a clear division between newspapers, and this sort of newspapers which are usually afternoon papers, tabloid, which are really of extremely low quality. And there was my photo on the first page that he wants to divide Poland. And that is because after one of the elections, I made in my Twitter a suggestion, how about if we start thinking about federal Poland? And you know, I hadn't, because I live outside Poland, I hadn't imagined what a great amount of reaction, negative reaction I would have. And I thought, well, in Poland, we have now, like in so many countries, we have by and large division in cultural and political and religious sense between two parts of the country. In Poland, it happens to be the West and the East. And there are clear divisions in customs, in support for religion, in openness towards Europe, etc. And I thought that in some aspects, these divisions should be respected. For example, even school curriculums, things like this. And once I said that and mentioned the F word, which is federalism, you know, I was accused, and I'm not an important person there, but they thought it important enough to put my photo, my picture, which sort of I was proud of to some extent. On the first page, a color picture, but you know, it was like the enemy. They didn't use the word enemy of the people. They say, he wants to divide Poland. So it's basically, you are against sovereignty. You are against national independence. You are the enemy, if you want to. So, and of course, federalism is a form of decentralization. It's decentralizing power by entrenching the power of local government, whether it's called state or province or land or whatever, you know. So their powers vis-a-vis the power of central government are not just a matter of unilateral decision of the central government, they are constitutionally entrenched. But that's not the case in countries governed by populists, because populists are centralizers. And that's perhaps why, when you think of it, I can't think now of any federal system, maybe except for India, because it's a real federation, where you have populists in power. I mean, the federations in Europe, especially Germany, but also Austria, you know, they don't have populists in power. Other great federations in the world, the United States, Australia, Canada, no populists in power. Somehow the decentralization and populism are at loggerheads with each other. Yes? Yeah, Brazil is a good example. Brazil is federation, yes? Good. Was it? But Russia is no longer populist, really. I mean, okay, yeah, it used to, yeah. But Russia, Federation of Russia was also a strange type of federation. Under the Soviet Union, it was completely sham. But even later, under Yeltsin, the problem with Russian Federation is that it was so incredibly asymmetrical. I mean, normal federations are where the entities of the federation are more or less equivalent. Not exactly, of course, and you have like in the United States, we have small states like Vermont and huge states like Texas, but still in Russia, it was, I don't know, 90% was Russia, which in itself was federation, and then there were these other entities. Okay, but Brazil, who mentioned Brazil? Yeah, you are right, you are absolutely right. Brazil is an exception to it, so I would have to rethink this thought. Okay, how about if you now take, what, 15 minutes? Okay. Ok, penso che siamo pronti. Allora, sì, posso cominciare? Grazie. So, let us now move to the second part of today's lecture, and I will try to, as instructed by Professor Barbizon, I will try to move to more or less 12:30, no later, yes, or 12:15, 3/4 of an hour up to an hour, okay, so that I do not torment you too much with this bad English of mine. Now, I would like to talk in the second half of this lecture about institutional conduct of populists. Basically, to ask a general question, are populists institutionalist or non-institutionalist or anti-institutionalist? That is, do populists observe and respect, comply with institutions, or rather reject them? And the answer must be nuanced, because in some ways it is yes and no. Yes, they are institutionalists in the sense that they usually work within the inherited institutions. That is, those institutions which they inherit from the ancien regime, from the time before they came to power. And with some exceptions, of which Hugo Chavez is most obvious, but with that exception, those paradigmatic, most important populists learn to live within the institutional structure they inherit from their predecessor. Often they make it also almost a virtue by saying, look, we are not like Bolsheviks, like Leninists, like Hitler, like Mussolini, like, you know, all these extreme leaders who first thing they come to power, they basically erase the institutional structure. No, we work within the institutional structure, and that is in one sense true. But in the other sense, it is not true, because they do convert those institutions from within. What they do is hollow them out in a way in which I will describe it in a little moment in more detail. But I would like to begin this section by briefly reflecting upon what are the general functions of institutions as such, per se, not that particular institution or this institution, but of institutions as such. And there is already a good deal of important work, sociological, in political science and law, about the very idea of institutionalization. Perhaps one of the greatest, most important classical writer on it is a great American sociologist of law, Philip Selznick, no longer alive, who wrote a lot about institutions and organizations and how institutions differ from organizations. But let me translate this sophisticated literature to something very, very simple. Let me suggest that the institutions, in their ideal sense, in the way in which they should work in a society, have two fundamental functions, two fundamental practical functions. One is a temporal function, and another is what may be called counterbalancing function. First is a temporal matter. Institutions slow down a decision-making and decision implementation process so that they block certain immediacy. Okay, someone has an idea, and this idea catches attraction, and many people are attracted to it. We should prohibit abortion. We should establish death penalty. We should relax protection of certain environmental aspects, whatever. You know, there is an idea, there is a preference in someone's mind. And then on the other side, there is actually implementation. There is a law enacted, and this law becomes implemented. An idea of institutions is to relatively slow down that process from A to Z, from the idea in the mind of someone that it will be a good thing, to Z, which is actual implementation. Institutions bring in certain intermediary stages. There must be some consideration of it. Usually the consideration goes through certain hierarchical order in an institution. For some type of decisions, there may be certain audit necessary, financial audit, environmental audit, etc. Then we have then if the matter arrives after, say, it has been decided somewhere in the ministry of something or other, when the matter comes to the legislature, there is a very often very stylized, canonical process of various stages that a bill has to go through. First reading, then the reading in the commission, then the second reading, then there is certain order in which, nothing can be immediate. That's what institutions do. Institutions prevent immediacy. That's the first function. And the second function is the function of counterbalancing an idea by counter ideas. Okay, so institutions allow, again, in their ideal version, we are talking about a certain model, which is normative model, but let's hope that many institutions try to approximate that idea. That, okay, I have a particular idea. Say, I believe it will be good to reintroduce death penalty. Now, I have this idea in an institution must face counter ideas. So there may be someone within an institution who say, no, you can't do it. We are in the European Union. The European Union observes the rights of the Council of Europe, and under a protocol to European Convention of Human Rights, you cannot have death penalty. Okay, one problem. Another will be someone who says, well, it's a bad idea also because there is, the arguments which you provide actually do not stand the test of verification or falsification, etc. So there will be, again, in a well-functioning institution, a starting idea about what to do must be confronted by challenges. And this idea will be checked. And we'll see what emerges at the end of this little marketplace of ideas that occurs in the institution. This is, in my view, a certain ideal model of institutions. There are, of course, many other things about institutions, but these things are important for me in this debate because populists, at least those paradigmatic populists, hate both these things. They hate the slowing down, and they hate the counterbalancing. So first with the temporal aspects. Very often it is observed that populists believe as if there was no tomorrow. Everything has to be today. Okay? There is certain immediacy there. Okay, here the leader comes up with a particular view, tomorrow it will become law. And sometimes it actually happens like that. In Poland, there were cases in which a proposal, a bill, so-called private members bill, which was in fact governmental bill, but proposed by an individual member of parliament, because in that way everything goes much quicker and you don't have to have certain audits and so on, was put into the standing order of the parliament in the evening. You have the compulsory committee meetings overnight. In the morning, there was a vote, and around the noon, the president would sign it. When the government really wanted to achieve certain things, especially about judicial laws, statutes, it occurred like that. Everything went through in 24 hours. And the opposition was basically silenced because they were in minority. They were silenced, literally speaking. Not as a metaphor, their microphones were turned off if they overrun a ridiculously short number of time given to them by the chairman of the meeting. So there is this cult of immediacy. Why wait? Everything is urgent. Everything must be decided as quickly as we come up with an idea. So there was a very good article called not immediate democracy, there was another word which will come to me by a young scholar from the UK of Taiwanese origins. And he basically described populism through this point of view, through this shortening of the period of time that it takes between someone comes up with idea and decision. And so populists dislike that. Actually, much of their legitimacy, that is their popularity, is based, look, we are a can-do people. We can do things, we don't waste time on all this, contemplation and discussion, interminable discussion. They make fun of the traditional elites, they are chatting classes, etc. They talk and talk and talk and do nothing. Well, we do things, okay, it's a good idea, fine, you've got it. There is a law. And the second aspect of the institutions, which they do hate, is this idea that within the institutions provide a platform, a forum for opposing an idea with counter ideas. Again, they cannot be counter ideas. If Orban or Kaczynski or Bolsonaro know what is the real interest of the people, then why weakening the interest of the people by doubts, by hesitations, by counter views? The opposition must be silenced because they are enemies of the people. I'm bringing certain, of course, argument to absurdity, to the extreme. But at the extreme, populists work like this. So, enough of the talk, action. That's the order of the day. And in that sense, these two fundamental functions are disliked, despised indeed, by populists in power, even if they don't say that when they fight for the power. But I also said that they found a way of living within the institutional structure, but they do certain things to the institutions. I use this metaphor of hollowing out, of turning them into empty shells. It looks like it is still the same institution, but it is deprived of its original meaning. And the most extreme way in which they convert the institutions without changing their external shape into something else is what they do to courts, especially to constitutional courts. Now, the second part of this part of the lecture will be about courts specifically. But let me just foreshadow this point. Constitutional courts are normally, in the traditional liberal democratic approach to constitutional courts, whether they are called constitutional courts or whether they are supreme courts, but also exercising the function of constitutional scrutiny, are considered to be quote-unquote counter-majoritarian institutions. That is, they are there deliberately to counter the majority will. An idea being democracy is majority rule, but this majority cannot be unlimited. It must be constrained by reference, say, to individual rights, so that even the majority cannot override, say, minority religious rights. We don't like that particular religion, so we will delegalize it. But the court is there to enforce those restrictions on majority rule under the Constitution. When you look at the way in which constitutional courts are being converted in populist states, they start performing an opposite role. A Polish constitutional tribunal, which initially was an imperfect body, but tried to play this counter-majoritarian role, that is to constrain the legislative action, became, under the rule of the law and justice, a very active and helpful helper of the majority. By, for example, declaring invalid certain old pre-populist laws, it actually greatly helped the majority. So it's the opposite. It's still the same court. The building is the same. The name on the building is the same. I know the place very well because my Warsaw home is very close to Constitutional Tribunal. If you are passerby, if you came from Mars, you believe, yeah, that's exactly the same constitutional tribunal I saw before, but everything about it has changed. Not just the people, but also its fundamental function. So in a recent work of mine, I have produced a little list of actions, of institutional strategies of populists. What do they specifically do to institutions in order to convert them to their new function? And this is a rough list. Okay, by the end of these lectures, I will learn how to use my remote. Okay, so these are 5 examples, just examples of what they do to the institutions to maintain the formal shell, but to completely hollow them out of the meaning. First, most obvious is capture, and with reference to courts is usually called court packing. So you still have exactly the same court, exactly as it was before. You just put your own people, and that makes all the difference, because these people will be loyal not necessarily to law but to you. Viktor Orban had a great saying that it's not the institutions which take decisions, people take decisions. And and there is a very perverse wisdom behind this saying, which seems to be obvious, but really it just shows that for populist leaders, what really matters is who, not what. Who will take those decisions? So if you have your own people, you can maintain the entire structure of an institution, say of a court, but they will do what you want them to do. So the capture is the most obvious thing. Supreme Court of the Philippines was captured by creating majority of pro-Duterte people. Bolsonaro hasn't managed to change. It was too difficult for him to operate the capture. But capture is the first step that populists do. The second is duplication. Okay, you maintain an institution intact, but create a new institution. Not by the constitution, because you don't have constitutional majority, but by statute. And this other institution sort of like shadows the initial institution, which you cannot capture, and takes over much of its activities. In Hungary, Orban has created sort of like shadow local government which is no longer autonomous but completely accountable to the government. So you still have traditional local government, but it's starved of money and functions. You have a new institution. In Poland, in addition to a constitutional media board, they have created by statute something called National Media Board, which is not provided in the constitution, but which is now peopled by the majority of law and justice people. It consists of 5 people. 3 of them represent the ruling majority, and they take most of the important decisions. So, it's actually very smart, because it looks like those old institutions are still in place. There are just some new institutions, and they take over. The third one is erosion. You deprive the institutions, you maintain the institutions, but in the budget, you don't provide them with a sufficient budget. Polish Ombudsman Office, they didn't manage in Poland to capture ombudsman, and it was the position, very important Polish constitutional structure was held by Professor Adam Bodnar, a real hero of Polish rule of law. They could do nothing to him. They couldn't touch him because his term of office was constitutionally entrenched. So they kept from year to year voting the lower and lower budget. He had to discharge some people. He had to make do in new and more demanding circumstances with lesser amount. But the really extreme example, and it almost sounds like a joke, because it was a joke, President Duterte in the Philippines, he hated the local Human Rights Commission because they were very strongly against his behavior, all these, killing the alleged drug traffickers and so on. He actually boasted how many people he individually killed, shot dead. He hated Human Rights Commission, so he made sure that the parliament 1 year has decided to change the budget. And the annual budget of Human Rights Commission in the Philippines was $25. 25, not 2,500 or 1,000 or million, $25, which basically meant closing down of the institution, of course. Then number 4 is what I call migration. That is, you migrate an institution from one place to the other. So in the institutional structure of the country. So there were 3 ombudsman offices in Hungary. Not a single ombudsman, but ombudsman for privacy, for 2 other things, socioeconomic rights and equality, I think. These were pretty independent institutions before Orban. He decided to put them into the structure of Ministry of Justice. So basically, okay, they are still the same institutions, but now they are subordinate to the minister. And so all the independence goes. And finally, you have what I call internal restructuring. So yeah, okay, you still have a given institution, but now it's structured in such a way that the independence of it cannot be any further maintained. So you see, there's the whole menu, the whole suite of different strategies, which can be done by statutes without touching the constitution and without touching formally the institutions, but you basically change them in various ways in such a way that they stop being independent. Now, I would like now to make a short digression about the idea of majority rule, because majority rule seems, I mean, one of the legitimating arguments that populists use is we are majoritarian, therefore we are democratic. We are actually super majoritarian, because what is important about populists is they do exploit this legitimacy that they get from the elections, and for them it's the only source of legitimacy. Now, in a healthy democracy, there are different sources of legitimacy. Fundamental is, of course, electoral legitimacy, but there may be legitimacy based on skills, expert legitimacy, or, you know, there may be legitimacy typical for judges, for example, based on impartiality connected with professionalism, etc. But in their rhetoric, populists behave as if the only source of political legitimacy were based on the decision of the popular sovereign, that is, of the people. So let me make this little aside, a little digression, because here I would like to advertise to you a wonderful book that Professor Barbizan co-edited with Giuliana Amato and Cesare Piselli, called Rule of Law versus Majoritarian Democracy. I know it's a very interesting title. There are situations in which fidelity to the rule of law puts you at loggerheads and the antinomy to the principles of majoritarian democracy. And my chapter in that book was to pick up an idea to what extent populist approach to majority rule is really democratic and consistent with the rule of law. And basically, to summarize my argument there, was that majority rule has to be defended on some further grounds. It is sort of like, it's not like self-justifying. There's nothing particularly magic about the fact that a particular decision is taken by majority. You must have some reasons for it. So in my chapter, I'm trying to dig into those reasons. And some reasons are better, other reasons are worse. For example, if someone believes that majority rule is good because it is closer to unanimity, then it's a bad argument, because it is still not unanimity. And by the way, what's so precious about unanimity? It requires some extra argument. Or that it is a very simple decision to take. There are even simpler decisions. One person's rule that is ruled by a dictator is simpler, but it doesn't mean that it's better, etc. So I believe that probably the best defense of majority rule is that it respects the principle of political equality. That is, that in a situation in which we necessarily will have a division of society into majority and minority on any given issue, because every society as we know them is pluralistic. so people have different views because they have different ideologies, identities, and interests, then the principle of majority, that is that the binding decision should respect the preferences of the majority, is the closest to endowing everyone with equal impact upon the decisions. But if that's the case, if indeed majority rule can be defined on the basis of political equality, then political equality has certain requirements which have to be met. And if those requirements are not met, then the whole defense of majority rule becomes empty. And I believe that political equality requires, why in its core requires respect for majority rule, but requires also certain degree of restrictions on majority rule. Restrictions which are necessitated by this fundamental idea of political equality. For example, that minority has to be consulted. You lose all political equality if you happen to be in minority and you are not even consulted on the decision to take. So that maybe your view will not prevail, but part of your view, some aspects of your ideas will make it into the final decision. Things like that. And then, having identified these additional requirements for majority rule, which are necessitated by the principle of political equality, I just find that in reality, the institutional reality of populism negates rather than supports this principle of political equality. Why? And here is a little landscape of institutional reality of populism in power. And let me go back to the two dimensions of institutions I have introduced right at the beginning. So first is the temporal dimension. That is that in democracy, we require a degree of time precisely for consultation, coordination, reflection, second thought. I mean, you buy an insurance, and the insurer, a good insurer, would give you like a cooling off period. You can renounce your insurance policy within 1 week or 1 month or whatever. This is a good idea, which corresponds to the fact that sometimes we take decisions impulsively, and they are not necessarily the best decisions for us. And the same is in the society. You need the cooling off period. You need to have those road bumps in order to think again. And that is required by, but populism does not respect that. And also the second, the one which I list here in green, is about the centralization of power, that populism dismantles checks and balances, power sharing, separation of powers, and also other constraints on power. It basically says majority rule is all that matters, and that's it. And we don't have to put any external checks on it. And if that's the case, this is fundamentally unfair to those who happen to be in the minority, because they didn't have their say, they day in court, so to speak. And therefore, and for this reason, majority rule, unrestrained by all those constraints, cannot enjoy support from political equality, and therefore is not justified, okay, as a best, most democratic mode of decision taking. Now, I would like now to move on to identify as examples electoral institutions in populism. And then I'll drop my review of other institutions, because I want to go straight to courts, and that will be the last part of my today's lectures. So I would like to show you, based on a case study, and the case study is very topical, because the case, that is Hungary, just had its elections a few months ago. Elections in which majority re-elected Viktor Orban to power, and in which the anti-Orban coalition lost quite miserably. And I want to give you a little, if you like, anatomy of how populists corrupt electoral system in a way as to assure their victory. Now, this assurance is never 100% certain. That is what makes populist governments still sort of hybrid governments rather than openly non-democratic. This is consistent with what I said at the beginning, that populism maintains a degree of electoral legitimacy. But it doesn't mean that the elections, while being free, are completely fair. And this is an extreme example. No other populist government of the populist governments I mentioned here, whether it's Venezuela, Brazil, India, Poland, the Philippines, went as far as Hungary in so comprehensively undoing fairness of the electoral system. And I just want to precede it by saying election, but I think I had mentioned it yesterday. Elections are absolutely crucial to populists. They are crucial because they provide them with the strongest, perhaps the only factor of their legitimacy. That is, that they were appointed, elected, generated by the majority of people. And it's not false. It's not false. They do enjoy that legitimacy. But this decision often is what's the word, poisoned by various failures of the electoral system. So Orban, throughout the years, managed to end up with what I call a four-tiered system of electoral distortion. Okay, distortion is the word I was missing. You know, the system is basically distorts the generation of the popular power, and in translating raw votes into the outcome. So, first of all, when he came to power, he cut the size of the parliament in half. It was a very popular decision. You know, the argument, you know, do we have to pay all these talking politicians in the capital city so much? You know, if we have 400, well, how about 200? If we have 300, how about 150? He basically cut the size of the parliament in half. But in terms of the election, it means that it gave a huge, huge advantage to the majority party and disadvantage to possible coalition, because in the coalition, minor junior partners, which in the large sized parliament would still have a hope of making it through the threshold and above the threshold, basically lose their power. I mean, the smaller the parliament is, the more it privileges the big parties. The second was, and he also, not only he cut it in half, but he also converted the two-round elections into one-round election. I mean, two-round elections basically means that in the first round, each party competes against each other party, but then in the second round, they compete only the two biggest, the best faring candidates compete against each other. Having just one tour means that the opposition coalition will have incentive of fighting against each other and not just against the incumbent. Second is just the good old-fashioned gerrymandering. He quite thoroughly, and he spent a lot of good expertise on it, changed the boundaries of electoral district. And there have been some very good mathematical studies shown that if he didn't change, if the old boundaries of the district were to be maintained, he wouldn't win the elections of 2010. So there was a study made by Professor Kimlane Szepele of Princeton University, a great specialist in Hungarian system. She actually employed some number crunching political scientists who did all that and who proved beyond any doubt that the changed boundaries of electoral district were actually instrumental in the victory of Orban. The third strategy was even more inventive, and it became known as, quote unquote, replacement of the electorate. How did it operate? On the one hand, in the countries to which many Hungarians emigrated, especially in the UK and Ireland, they established only 1 or 2 electoral commissions. So if you were a migrant in the UK, you had to go and say you were in Liverpool or Manchester or somewhere in the north. You had to go all the way, all day to London, because there are only 2 electoral commissions in the entire UK. That was London and Glasgow. Okay, so it more or less eliminated a large number of voters. Now, who emigrated? Who were those voters? Well, largely they were young, professional, often in sort of knowledge industry, IT people, etc., and therefore, by definition, anti-Orban. You know, people who emigrated already largely because they didn't like this government, and also were socialized, say, by liberal democratic values of the community in which they lived. At the same time, Orban gave power of vote to a great number of ethnic Hungarians in the neighboring countries, where, as you know, after Trianon Treaty, Hungary became largely reduced in size, and there is a large Hungarian community in Slovakia, in Serbia, and mainly in Romania. And these are people who, just it happens, are very traditionalist. Of course they are, you know, I mean, they love their Hungary and they feel themselves being left out, you know, they yearn to rediscover their Hungarianness, whatever it means, you know, goulash and Bela Bartok and all this stuff. And now the gesture of the government would say, yes, we create to you a charter of Hungarian and you can vote in our elections, is something for which they are deeply grateful. They also happen to be lesser educated and less prosperous and working in farm, mainly in the agriculture, a typical voter of Fidesz. In addition, an argument was, we cannot publish their lists, the list of voters. Why? Because the government in which they live will dislike it. So say Romanian government will feel that, you know, if they have access to list of voters, of Hungarian background voters in Romania, they will treat them in a discriminatory way because they will see them as being disloyal or having divided loyalty. We have to protect them, so we won't publish. So you have a situation in which there was a total secrecy around this huge number of voters. So on one hand, you basically remove one part of the electorate and add another part of the electorate, hence, you know, the victory. And finally, the simplest thing is capture of election commission, something that, by the way, happened also in Poland. That is, the electoral commissions are no longer consisting of independent judges, as was the case before, but basically bureaucrats which are subordinate to the government. This is, I went into some detail just to show you, because sometimes you need to have this meat, you know, to give some meaning to a general statement that the elections are no longer fair. They may be free, no one forces anyone to vote, or no one compels anyone from voting, but through the combination, through the mix of such strategies, you very much tilt the playing field to your benefit. Let me now move. Oh, I will never learn. Okay. Let me move to the question of courts. I jumped over some slides because I want to end in 10-15 minutes. There is a nice book, famous book, very famous book, which is part of the American classical legal literature by Alexander Bickel, called The Least Dangerous Branch. And that's about courts. And of course, it's slightly ironic title, but an idea is that the Supreme Court of the United States is the least dangerous branch. It doesn't have its own huge budget. It doesn't have the power of purse or sword, as they say. You know, that it can do nothing. I mean, you know, if the Supreme Court decides that the president has done something wrong, it cannot send its army and introduce the order. So all it has is the power of argument, of reasoning. That's its only legitimacy. So that's a sort of nice story. But why I'm mentioning? Because I'm paraphrasing Bickel's The Least Dangerous Branch to something slightly more upsetting, that the courts are not only the least dangerous, but also the least resilient. Resilient in the sense immune to pressure, immune to aggression, to assault. Okay? They are defenseless. They can do very little. And so courts are usually the first institutional target of populist assault. That's a quasi-universal law of populism in power. Their first anger, aggression, is against courts. Why is that? Well, that's very simple. That's because, as I say on the top of my slide here, courts present what I call alternative legitimacy. Because courts do not derive their legitimacy from direct elections. Not even indirect elections in the case of constitutional courts elected by the parliament. That's not their main source of legitimacy. Their main source of legitimacy is they sort of are an expression of a paradigm of an impartial mediator or arbiter or umpire between conflicting parties. And as long as those conflicting parties believe in impartiality, neutrality of umpire, plus his or her intelligence, I mean, you can be impartial but know nothing, you know, but combination of their professionalism and impartiality is a source of the legitimacy which allows people to comply and respect their decisions even if they don't like them. This goes back to a wonderful little book by Professor Martin Shapiro, a constitutional scholar of Berkeley, called simply Courts. And there's where he developed this idea. Courts derive their legitimacy from this myth or, you know, pattern of two conflicting parties and a third party. So there is a triad who is basically impartial and who will and he says that all the modern courts basically can be based in some sort of echoing or repeating that type of idea. But populists hate an idea of there being an alternative legitimacy, whether it's legitimacy based on impartiality or legitimacy based on expertise. Think about Trump's hatred of medical experts on COVID, something to which I will refer tomorrow. Basically, all legitimacy is theirs, and that is electoral legitimacy. So populists in power use, again, a whole suite package of strategies trying to weaken and ideally capture independent courts. They do it through what may be called hostile takeovers, for example, by court packing and institutional restructuring. The court packing has had place in basically all populist states which I had studied, but I know best how it happened in Poland, where Polish Constitutional Tribunal was consisting of 15 judges as a result of purely illegal pressure, such as not recognizing the election by previous parliament, and on the natural attrition, stepping down at the end of their terms, and appointment of politically correct judges, basically turned Constitutional Tribunal by the end of 2016 into a completely subordinated body, which becomes, I call it, willful enabler. So populism in power has been translated into populism on the court. This capture wasn't as perfect in other countries. In Hungary, they managed it through combination of actions. For example, they increased the composition of their constitutional court from 11 to 15, and those extra 4 were already appointed by Orban. With the stepping down of previous judges, they achieved a majority of pro-Orban judges, but not exclusivity, as was the case of Poland. But they also importantly changed the procedures and the competences of Hungarian Constitutional Court. When it comes to procedures, for example, they have abolished what was called actio popularis. That is a citizen's complaint which is open to everyone, regardless of any criteria of standing, you know, whether you have actual legal interest in something. That was the most open system of constitutional review in the world. They have abolished it. They have also introduced a requirement of supermajority for decisions which invalidate laws. But they also changed the judicial competences. For example, the amendment to the new constitution said that the court cannot refer to any of its case law which concerned previous constitution. In other words, a huge body of case law in the history of Hungarian Constitutional Court became overnight like empty. They can't refer to it. And they can't take decisions which have clearly budgetary consequences. So there was an important way in which Hungarian Constitutional Court, while not fully converted into a willful enabler as in Poland, more or less became toothless. But this wasn't without any consequences. I mean, independent courts are useful to power, even if occasionally they take decisions which the power doesn't like. There is a phenomenon called by some theorists of constitutional review a blame game. You know, there are some decisions which have to be taken, but which will be very unpopular. So you throw it upon the court, you know, and the court will take the decision. They can do it. They are well remunerated. They are not accountable to the society. They have usually constitutional court. They have term limits. Regular court have no tenure up to retirement. You know, they can afford being unliked, and everyone is happy. The courts get their position of independence. The politicians have someone to blame to the population. But you cannot blame a court which is completely dependent, because population will not buy it. So that when Polish Constitutional Tribunal less than 2 years ago has taken a decision which basically delegalized all abortion, with one tiny, statistically insignificant exception, that is when there is a direct threat to the life of the woman, of pregnant woman, all other previous grounds for abortions have been found by Constitutional Tribunal as inconsistent with the Constitution. No one in Poland, and especially not women who went on the streets to protest against it, protested against the tribunal. They protested against the government, because no one in their good senses would think, well, this is the tribunal's own decision. It was clearly a decision of the government, which was here pressured by the church. And the government wanted to have good relationship with the church because the elections was soon. And therefore, they took this decision through the helpless and powerless device of so-called Constitutional Tribunal. So there are certain, costs that populists have to incur by disempowering, incapacitating courts in such a way. And there is an interesting story to be told about different responses by judges, because so far I've been talking about one side of the coin, that is what populists do to judges. But how do judges react? And when we look at the whole world of today's populism, you see that the reactions vary. In some countries, judges are actually quite openly critical. Anti-Bolsonaro judges, such as Judge Roberto Cardoso in Brazil, was one of the famous examples. Many judges in Poland which are protesting both through judicial actions and extrajudicial statements. There are situations in which judges sort of try to sit low. The Supreme Court of India is an example in which judges, while not becoming openly anti-government, are at the same time not too strong in their following Modi's instructions. I mean, they have already experience of this sort of wait and see, and not provoke the government, but at the same time not to be completely servant of the government. The Supreme Court of India has an experience under the period of emergency of Indira Gandhi. They are basically taking a similar strategy now. And there are situations in which judges become simply cynical and act in accordance with the decisions of politicians. I think this is, from all the reports I have from my Hungarian colleagues and friends, this is by and large the case of the judiciary. Let me say at the end something about so-called discriminatory legalism. That is the way the populists use law to selectively discriminate against and harass their opponents. A beautiful motto for this concept of discriminatory legalism, which is a popular concept in political science, is taken from President of Peru in the first half of 20th century, who had this beautiful sentence: "Everything for my friends, for my enemies the law." And that nicely encapsulates the approach of populists. They use law with all its severity in accordance with its letter, but use it selectively. So they don't use it against their own people. So this is a photo in which, I apologize, this is my little self-promotion. Here I am in a courtroom in Warsaw where I'm defending one of my sort of defamation cases against me. And you can see someone, actually I know who, Professor John Morin, who came as an observer from the Netherlands, keeping this badge of the Constitution, which you have already seen. And I'm sitting in the bench of defendants, and this is audience, and therefore defamation suits are one of the preferred ways that the populists use against their opponents, but they don't use it ever against their own people. They harass judges, they harass prosecutors if they do not take decisions which are consistent with their preferences. So let me very briefly end by going back to an idea of judicial resistance. And if I had time, I could tell you much more about how Polish judges protest against the violations of rule of law in Poland. They often use extrajudicial methods, like you see on this photo, where you have judges demonstrating against political discharge of some judges. And this big placard says, "We demand return to the office of independent judges." And these are judges outside Polish Supreme Court. But they're also using judicial methods, typically judges' methods. for example, so-called regular judges, magistratura, not judges of constitutional court, start discovering that they can also use constitution to set aside, not necessarily to invalidate, but to set aside law which they consider to be unconstitutional. And they do it more and more often, because the constitution, both in accordance with the letter and the spirit of constitution, applies directly, not merely via statutes. And they often use European law, EU law, more specifically, but also the law of the European Convention of Human Rights, to strike down decisions, administrative decisions, which they consider to be inconsistent with the EU law, with the EU Charter. And also they more and more often raise questions of preliminary reference to the Court of Justice of the European Union to object to the statutes which limit judicial independence. So this is a sort of happy note, you know, the judges can and do find in themselves this courage and integrity and intelligence and stand up to populists. Okay, what questions, what comments and observations would you like to raise? Well, I guess we are all quite exhausted, so we might finish at that. Let me just tell you in 2 words what will be what I'll be talking about tomorrow. Tomorrow I will begin by giving you an account of the preferred populist rhetoric, discourse, the sort of arguments they use to win popularity. Then I'll spend some time talking about, you know, what is the verdict about populists coping with COVID, and to what extent populists have been successful compared to non-populist states in fighting the pandemic. And at the very end, I'll be talking about the ways out of populism. Okay, so thank you, and I'll see you tomorrow.